This is more relevant for corporate bonds, right? And even what type of corporate bonds? High yield, right? So high yield, or what we call junk or speculative grade, high yield, also called junk, also called speculative grade, right? Not investment grade, because you have your high yield bonds, then you have your investment grade, which is better credit quality, right? Large companies. And for your investment grade, which also includes your government bonds, AAA. So, what we have looked at in terms of your key rate, duration, and all this, your mod D, your effective duration, your effective convexity, that's all good for your government bonds. Why? Because government bonds have uh, the benchmark rate, which is your, I mean, their prices are obviously related to your the YTM of that bond, or even if you want to take the benchmark, the curve, then the benchmark will be the government bond rate itself. So they are more related to the benchmark itself. Now, what happens with corporate bonds is that the story is a little bit different. High yield corporate bonds, because let's say if this is your government bonds, right, and this is the yield curve. This is the yield curve for different maturities for government bonds, and this is the yield. So your corporate bonds are going to pay a little bit higher yield for the same maturities, obviously, right? Because the corporate is riskier, there is more default risk, right? Especially when we're talking about highly risky companies that are high yield or junk or speculative grade. And let me just remind you, with respect to the rating, that you have AAA and AA and A and then triple B, and then you're entering into double B, and like really bad beyond this. So you're naturally going to expect a higher rate for investing in these type of securities, a higher yield, and this is, by the way, known as the G spread. Now, why is all of this important, right? Because so far, the type of duration measures that we have been seeing are analytical durations, your mod D, and based on your mod D, you're calculating your key rate, right? They're all analytical in nature, but that approach implicitly assumes that the benchmark yields and credit spreads are uncorrelated with each other, which basically means that this benchmark rate, the rate on these government bonds, this yield and the spread that you're having is not related to each other. But that's not true. They are related to each other. And why they are related, so let me tell you. Now, you have to link this with your economics discussion, right? In economics discussion, what did we say about business cycles? What did we say about business cycles? That your GDP doesn't grow in a straight line like this, it grows like this, right? So this is the underlying trend, but sometimes you overheat, right? And then what happens is that the government has to pull the economy back. You have to increase interest rates and so on and so forth. High inflation is there. But what happens is when the government increases these interest rates, then there is a possibility of a recession. And then once you hit that, you know, that bottom part, and then you turn around. So interest rates going up and down obviously cause these boom and bust, or these peaks and these troughs, and that of course has an impact on corporations and their default risk. So there is definitely a link over here. What that link is something we're going to explore in this section. But for now, first, what I want to emphasize on is that what we have been looking at is analytical durations, And that's okay for your government bonds. But when you talk about trying to estimate the sensitivity, the price sensitivity of high yield bonds, now here we need to get into the world of empirical duration. And what does the word empirical mean? It means based on actual data, real actual data, right? Not your PV plus and PV minus, which is just analytical duration. All of this mod D, key rate, this is based on price of interest rate going down, price of interest rate going up. So that's just analysis. But empirical is based on actual data, and in this case, we'll take the bond prices, right, historically, and we will take the interest rate changes historically, and then we will see, okay, how sensitive are these bonds to changes in interest rate, right? And why this is important? Because in practice, benchmark yields and credit spreads are correlated, and they are correlated because of that whole discussion in economics that we have had, that of course your interest rate go up and down because, or your monetary policy is definitely influenced by your economic conditions, and economic conditions are definitely going to impact credit spreads, right? So this discussion is all linked, and if they are linked, then even though you can use analytical durations for measuring the duration of government bonds, but for corporate bonds, and especially high yield corporate bonds, you need to get into the world of empirical duration. So therefore, many fixed income analysts use an alternative approach called empirical duration, where you actually take real prices and check their relationship using statistical methods with the yield changes. Right. So, as discussed, for government bonds, analytical and empirical will be same or similar, but for your high yield bonds, they're going to be different. Right. Now, what happens? What happens in a recession? See, if this is your government bond rate, if this is, let's say, your yield curve, and there is a recession expected, right? If there is a recession expected, what people will do is they will start something called a flight to safety. A flight to safety. Now, what happens in a flight to safety is that people go and start buying these high quality government bonds, and the price of the bond goes up, which means if the coupon is not changing, right, so the yield goes down. Now, if this is your corporate yields, right, if this is your corporate yields and the yields on the government bonds are going down, so what is happening to your spread? Your spread will go up, right? Your spread will widen. So let's say this goes to here. So obviously your spread has now gone up. But that's okay, because if there is a stressful scenario, then there is a higher probability that those high yield bonds might default, and that spread going up is okay. So essentially, then what happens is that the corporate yield, the yield on the corporate bond is unchanged. Yield is unchanged because that's where it was before, right? It's just that your government bond yield goes down because government bond prices go up because of the flight to safety. And the spread between the government bond and the corporate bond goes up, and that's all right because it's a high stress environment and the probability of default is going up. So they should give us, the corporate high yield bond should give us a higher rate over and above the government rate, right? So therefore, since the yield is unchanged on the corporate bonds, so what happens is that the empirical duration is lower than the analytical duration. Let me just stop and explain this. See, if we had analyzed the empirical duration, it would have told us that the prices would have fallen, right? The prices would have fallen if the benchmark interest rate went up, then the price should have fallen. but the benchmark rate did go up, and the price would probably not have fallen that much, because as you saw, the yield wasn't changing. And if the yield is not going to be changing, the price is not going to be changing, because we know that the price is linked to changes in yield to maturity. But if the yield is not changing, well, the price is not going to be changing that much. So in reality, the empirical duration of high yield bonds is actually lower than what their analytical duration implies. So this is the main point over here, and that is because the government benchmark yields go down. And let me show you that again. The government benchmark yields come down, right? But the spread widens, and instead of the corporate yields also coming down, the corporate yields stay the same, and the sensitivity is therefore lower than what the analytical duration would tell you. So that's why it's important to look at empirical duration. So that is it, guys, for this very interesting learning module. What did we talk about over here? We said some bonds, some portfolios are having uncertain cash flows, and because of that uncertain cash flows, since their cash flows are contingent on certain things, so therefore they do not have a meaningful YTM, and that's why we cannot see their relationship to changes in YTM, right? What we want to see it is in terms of a benchmark rate, and we obviously call that the curve over here, because that is related to the benchmark yield curve, and hence we are using the word curve. It is actually the change in the benchmark rate that is there. So everything else is the same in terms of your approximate duration and approximate convexity formula, except for instead of taking change in YTM, we are taking change in the curve. Everything else is the same. Now this is very good. Effective duration and effective convexity are better than your yield based, because this is even more appropriate for larger changes in the interest rate, right? Your other one, approximate duration and approximate convexity, is mostly for small changes only. And like with approximate duration and approximate convexity, you can use effective duration and effective convexity to calculate the change in price of a bond, where this is obviously your adjustment coming from the duration, and this is coming from the convexity. This is the convexity adjustment, exactly the same as your approximate duration and approximate convexity. Instead of changing, however, instead of taking the change in YTM, we are taking change in curve. So that's the only difference, that we don't take change in YTM, we take the change in curve. Right, and then we looked at key rate duration. Very, very important, very interesting. More on this in level 2 and level 3, that you need to know where the duration of your entire portfolio, the weighted duration, the mod D of your entire portfolio, where is it coming from, right? What are the key rates? So which rate are you sensitive to? 1 year or 2 year or 5 year or 10 year or 20 or 30, right? So which rate are you really more sensitive to, and what is your expectation of the change in the shape of the yield curve, so you can position your portfolio accordingly. And finally, we looked at empirical duration, and this is more relevant for high yield bonds, right? Because, well, for government bonds, both approaches, which is empirical and analytical, will give you the same result or similar result, but for high yield, empirical will be lower. And the reason for that is that even when your flight to safety is there, so your corporate spread will widen and your yield will stay the same, and therefore it is less sensitive, and therefore your duration will be lower. So this is it, guys, for this learning module. Hope you enjoyed it, and as always, do a lot of questions to make sure that you understand all the concepts and you're ready for the exam.